Indigenous arrival, where I detailed the Quakers, abolitionists, and blacks in London County. The second book is especially concerned with answering the ways and means questions of how newly emancipated African Americans found a way to the Queens Bush settlement. It was when I went looking for possible crossing places on the Grand River that I discovered something I believe is the answer to the questions raised in both books. The Grand River is about 200 miles long. It stretches from Lake Erie to the Grey County Plateau, about 20 miles south of Collingwood on Georgian Bay. Remembering that native trails are the bed of the Underground Railroad, it's necessary to clear your mental map of South Central Ontario, clear it of all its roads and bridges, all its suburban sprawl. If William Kent arrived in what would become the Queens Bush in the 1820s, he would have followed native trails up the Grand River, past Kitchener. Just before you reach the gorges, anyone knows these big gorges, before you reach the gorges there was a ford. You cross the ford, travel to the northwest bank of Grand. From there is less than 15 kilometers from what was still unceded Saugeen Ojibwe territory, lands that became the Queens Bush settlement. Drawing on references in the early history of Elora, it became apparent that once a year, every winter, the Saugeen Ojibwe, whose territories extended north of Nolan Sound and west to Southampton on Lake Simcoe, would travel south to a spot above Elora where there was a wide fork, the easterly portion of which was used by the Coldwater Ojibwe from Matchedass Bay and Lake Simcoe, who would also travel in family groups, heading southwest to the Grand River Ford and down the trail south to Niagara. The reason for the annual trek was the 1764 Treaty of Fort Niagara, in which Sir William Johnson, representing the British, and in the full spirit of the Royal Proclamation, had made a pact between sovereign peoples. The Ojibwe walked to the Niagara region every year to celebrate and to renew the treaty. They camped on their old stopping places along the way, and the pioneers and their descendants welcomed them, which was in itself a reception rooted in the loyalist understanding of the importance of the First Nations to the survival of the colony and the province. I believe the question of how African Americans found their way to the Queens Bush before roads started being built north from the head of the lake to Guelph in the 1840s can be answered. They traveled north of the Ojibwe. The Saugeen clans went right through the settlement on their way home, and even the fugitives were traveling with the Coldwater Ojibwe. All they needed to do was get across the Grand and then to the fork in the trail above Elora to be most of their way to the largest settlement of former fugitive slaves in the colony. There's even more to it than that. In a book on the life of John Gull, head of the Canada Company, the land agency in charge of selling crown land in the colony, it's noted that in 1827, Gull explored the Huron tract to get a sense of the lands he had to sell. He set out from York, as Toronto was then called, traveled up Yonge Street to Newmarket. Yonge was the earliest road in the colony. They descended the Holland River and crossed Lake Simcoe, with singing boatmen a raced fast disappearing. The passage of that lake is exceedingly beautiful, but not picturesque. We met in the twilight of dawn with a canoe full of Indian children, piloted by a Negro. The presence of a Negro among the Ojibwe on Lake Simcoe is not surprising, since there was a black settlement in Oro Township in the northwest part of the lake, made up of men who had either been Revolutionary War-era loyalists or War of 1812 loyalists. An online York University document called Indigenous Peoples and Black People in Canada, Settlers or Allies, authors argue that historic black communities faced continuous pressures to whiten themselves culturally. Meanwhile, the intensity of control maintained over Indigenous communities prevented those black people with native heritage from turning to native communities in any large-scale manner for support. The result has been a legacy of silence about black Indianness in the Maritimes, a silence which is yet to be significantly broken. An even greater silence about the very existence of black Ojibways in central Ontario has also been maintained. In each case, the only communities who have acknowledged the existence of black Mi'kmaqs or black Ojibways have been the surrounding Mi'kmaq and Ojibwe communities. Nowhere is the presence of black Mi'kmaqs in the Maritimes and black Ojibways in central Ontario even mentioned in black histories of early Canada. A question which therefore must be asked is the extent to which black historians may need to revisit the past to examine whether the repertoire of black people as settlers in early Canada truly reflects the reality of black Indigenous connections. Although black historians ignore Indigenous presence, it is a hallmark of a more critical Canadian black writing that at least obliquely references Canada as a settler nation by invoking a contemporary Indigenous presence. Quotes. While I am not saying that the authors of the above quoted material are mistaken, documented evidence of Ojibwe communities laying claim to black members have not been found by me, except to the extent that around the time I published Laying the Bed, one of the elders of the Mississauga, the New Credit Reserve, asked a PhD student hired to digitize the band's historical records and to look for families of black heritage, including the elder's own family. The Groat Mikes, baptized by the Methodist Mississauga chief, Reverend Peter Jones, in 1833, are clearly an example of black Ojibwe and are the only families from the New Credit Reserve I know of that fit the elder's criteria. The Tuscarora Groats now fall into a similar category. What is also interesting is that the Reverend Peter Jones was stationed among the Coldwater Ojibwe for the time of the 1830s, which means that Jones, like the rest of the band, would have made the annual trek to Niagara from Coldwater and back again, thus making him the single likeliest native to have helped African Americans find their way to Queens Bush before the creation of roads in the 1840s. Methodists were known as staunch abolitionists, but it was the white Methodist Church that had invited the free black African Methodist Episcopal Church in America to come to the mission fields of British North America to minister to the temporal and spiritual needs of the fugitive slaves who were beginning to gather here in large number. And yet, not only was Jones stationed among the Coldwater Ojibwe in the mid-1830s, so was the Anglican missionary, Reverend Adam Elliott. Reverend Elliott was also the Anglican missionary to the Tuscarora in 1842, when the Groats and other Tuscarora Baptists had a confrontation with the Tuscarora Anglicans over access to the treaty gifts. To bring this topic to a close, let me begin by noting that Adam Elliott, while on the Grand River of the Anglican Mission, married Eliza Howells. Eliza's sister Emily married the future Mohawk chief, George Johnson, who was the Tuscarora translator for Elliott. Reverend Elliott was thus the uncle of the Mohawk poetess Pauline Johnson. But even more importantly, Elliott was the son-in-law of a Welsh Quaker living in America named Henry C. Howells, a man who had moved his family to the States after the passing of the Emancipation Act of 1833, in which Britain banned slavery throughout the empire. Henry C. Howells came to America for the sole purpose of fighting slavery. In the midst of all this narrative is a loyalist world now largely forgotten by Canada. The world is forgotten as a land once defined by primeval forests and by far-reaching watershed trails. A world in which whites, blacks, and First Nations created the Canada represented here today in this sacred space. We are the heirs of friendship chains, the heirs of covenant chains, and we are, as well, the heirs of those who broke the chains of slavery. I do go on at length, but I do have questions, so yes.